Good evening, everyone. Thank you for being here for this exciting and informative webcast, How to Bust Myths About Community Cats with Science. I'm Lynn Fridley, Program Manager for Maddie's Institute. Our speaker is Peter Wolf, Cat Initiatives Analysis for Best Friends Animal Society, one of the nation's largest animal welfare organizations and a leader in the development and operation of community cat programs. Before we start, let's talk about a few housekeeping items. Please take a look at the left side of your screen where you'll see a Q&A window. That's where you'll ask questions during the presentation, but don't hold them until the end. Questions asked in the last few minutes will probably not be processed in time for a response. If you need help with your connection during the presentation, you can click the Help widget at the bottom of your screen. The green File widget contains the presentation handout and a printable certificate of attendance for people attending this live event. So be sure to download, save, and print. Peter, thanks for being here with us tonight.
Thank you very much, Lynn. And I want to thank everybody at Maddie's Institute and at Maddie's Fund for all the support pulling this together. And in particular, I want to give a shout out to Christy Keith, who is with Maddie's. And Christy's also, she was an early reader and promoter of my blog, and she was instrumental in making this happen this evening. So again, a special thank you to Christy. And of course, I also want to thank everybody who took time out of their busy schedules to join us online tonight. Let's see, just going to up ahead there. Okay. And I want to make sure that the first slide is now visible before I continue. Are we good?
Yes, we're good.
Awesome. Okay, thank you. As Lynn mentioned, I'm with Best Friends Animal Society. My title is Cat Initiatives Analyst. I often tell people I'm a research analyst or I'm a policy guy, sort of vague responses like that, in part because despite being with Best Friends for about 2.5 years now, I still haven't figured out quite how to describe what it is I do. In fact, the best description came from a barista at a favorite coffee shop of mine who just said very simply, "Oh, you protect cats for a living." And to date, that's the best description I've got. So I probably should update my business cards to reflect that. As was mentioned previously, I also have a blog. I've been blogging about TNR and various related issues for about 5.5 years now. You can see there the URL. You can also find me on Facebook and Twitter. If you're interested in the sort of topics we're going to be talking about tonight, which is a lot of policy, a lot of science, obviously. If you're interested in this, I would encourage you to sign up for the blog. It's free, it's easy, and then you get the email updates. All right, just a quick overview of what we're going to cover tonight. First, I want to start very kind of big picture with and answer the question, why do we need to address these various myths? I then want to take a little bit of a detour and talk about public policy, looking at TNR solely through the lens of public policy, not through the humane lens or animal welfare lens, but just through public policy. And then we'll get to the core of the presentation, the actual myth busting, and then a quick wrap up, and then Q&A. And the hope is I'm going to go through the presentation fairly quickly, hopefully not too much, but fairly quickly so that I can leave about 20 or 30 minutes for Q&A at the end. And as Lynn mentioned, please, as soon as a question pops in your mind, please get that question in the queue so that it has a better chance of allowing time at the end so I can respond to that question. Before
so to start it out, we have our first poll question. And Peter is asking these questions. He wants to know, I'd like to get a sense of who's joining us this evening. So which of the following categories best describe you? Animal shelter, animal welfare staff, paid. Animal shelter, animal welfare volunteer, unpaid. TNR staff, volunteer advocate, or other. Please answer on your screen. Just write directly on your screen. Just answer that question. We'd like to get a sense of who's joining us this evening. Which of the following categories best describe you? We have quite a few people in the audience, and we'll wait just a second or two more as you make your selection. And then here we are. We've gone to the results slide, Peter. There, what do you think?
Okay, this is, I suppose, pretty much what I expected in that the third category, that TNR staff / volunteer / advocate, is almost half of the audience. And admittedly, these are really coarse categories. I mean, there's a big bucket in which to put all these different folks. And of course, some of us wear different hats. So that's why I worded it the way I did about the category that best describes you. So again, it's pretty much what I expected, and I like the fact that there is a range of backgrounds represented here. So that's great. And it's really helpful going forward. Now, as I said, I want to start kind of big picture and just when I try to answer the question, why do we need to address these various myths? I mean, there's a great momentum behind TNR right now. Some of us, or at least me, I feel very comfortable getting down in the weeds with these various studies and all the rest, like we're going to get into in a little bit here. This is certainly not for everybody. So why bother with this? And I kind of come up with four responses that come to mind. And the first has to do with, I think any policy discussion, it doesn't matter what it is, if we're talking about education, if we're talking about a new public transit system in our communities, whatever, any policy discussion has to begin with a real grounding in the facts. Obviously, or at least hopefully, we don't go to the mainstream media, or at least that's not the only place we go to get our facts, because there we find a lot of misleading information and a lot of information that's actually factually incorrect. And one of the reasons for this is so much of the science being reported is flawed. And it's produced by individuals and organizations that openly, in many cases, not all, but openly oppose TNR. And so again, if we want to have this kind of respectful, thoughtful conversation about policy, this doesn't do us any favors. The second reason that comes to mind is I think it's important folks who do TNR, folks who promote TNR, I think too often they feel an internal conflict, like it's either TNR or it's wildlife conservation, but you have to pick sides, or it's TNR or public health. And this is not at all the case, but it's easy, again, especially if we get caught up in these mainstream media reports, it's easy to think that that's exactly what it is. And we can see here, these are just screenshots that I grabbed from different recent stories about where is there controversy, right? And of course, we know that, especially these days, controversy translates to clicks and eyeballs, which translate to advertising revenue. So there's a strong incentive there for these kinds of stories, and it's easy to get wrapped up in that. And again, think that by supporting TNR, you're actually, making these really consequential trade-offs, which is not actually the case, as we'll see as we get into the science a little bit.
And here's our second poll of the evening. On a scale of 1 to 10, describe how prepared you feel right now, before we begin this webinar, to respond thoroughly to critics of TNR. And your choices are 1 to 2, 3 to 4, 5 to 6, 7, 8, 9 to 10. Please answer on your screen and not in the Q&A window. Answer this question on your screen. On a scale of 1 to 10, describe how prepared you feel right now before we begin this webinar to respond thoughtfully to the critics of TNR.
And I guess I should have been a little more specific, assuming that 10 means completely prepared, and you're wondering, like, why is this guy given the webcast instead of me?
Okay, 10 is completely prepared, 1 is unprepared.
Correct.
Let's look at the results, Peter.
Okay, well, this is good. Had the vast majority said, check that last category, 9 to 10, then I, would have had this kind of crisis right now, because I would have wondered what was the point of going on. So this is good, and there's obviously folks who, a small number, just 7.4%, but a small number who really feel like, help, I need a lot of help here. And then there's a lot of folks in the middle. It's kind of a turn it sideways, and it's kind of a bell curve. So again, this is great. This is, if I were doing this as a class that folks signed up for, which is sort of what this is, this would be exactly the sort of demographics I'd be looking for. So this is good news. The third reason, and this is why I kind of wanted that poll question where it was, is the third reason why do we need to address these myths is because advocates, there's this need, and again, I don't need to tell the audience, you just responded exactly this way. There's a need to be able to respond thoughtfully to folks who are opposed to, or even just skeptical, on the fence when it comes to TNR. And, this could be ordinance changes, it could be talking to the media, it could be online comments, it could be a letter to the editor in the local paper if TNR is being discussed and debated in your community. Now that said, I want to put kind of a big caveat that when we get into the weeds, the kind of stuff that's in this presentation, a great deal of it it's in the weeds. As I say, it's very detailed. If you're talking to your city council, you might have 3 minutes in a public meeting. That is not the time to bring out all the kind of stuff you're going to see, and hear tonight. Nor, if you're lucky enough to get a couple minutes to talk to, say, a local reporter, again, it's not the time to get into the weeds, but again, this gives you a foundation from which you can build and feel very confident in those other contexts. And then actually, I don't, for the fourth reason, I mentioned there were 4, we've covered 3, and I don't have a separate slide for this. The first 3, I think, are very nuts and bolts, right? There's the, if you want to have an honest policy discussion, you got to have the facts. There's the notion of reducing and eliminating that sense of internal conflict. And then this third one, to be able to respond thoughtfully. They're very nuts and bolts kind of oriented. And the fourth one is a little bit different, but I think it's really important. And it's maybe more philosophical. And that has to do with the fact that you've got folks out there, as we'll see when we get into the kind of the core of the presentation, you've got folks out there who are actively they're using science, they're hijacking science to undermine TNR efforts. And as a result, bottom line is a number of cats are dying, have died, and will continue to be killed because of this. And what's at stake here is an honest debate about the issues and what do we do about this. And so, to my mind, it's a real issue of injustice. And that, for me, that part of it really is what resonates and motivates me and compels me to take action. And I don't want to get too preachy about it, but again, I think I'm sure I'm not the only one out there who sees this as a real issue of injustice. And so I think that I just didn't want to leave that out when I talked about, why do we need to address these various issues. Again, there's a number of lenses, if you will, through which we can see TNR. We could see it as purely animal welfare or a humane issue, I want to talk about just for a few minutes just as a public policy issue. And what we know, and I see we, regardless of where you stand on the issue, we know there are two approaches, only two, known to reduce the number of unowned, free-roaming or community cats. We've got intensive TNR efforts, and again, if you're on the line, I trust quite familiar with these. We're talking about targeted, whether it's zip codes, neighborhood, colony level, and increasingly shelter-based return to field programs. The other way we know how to reduce numbers is through the kind of intensive eradication efforts that have been used on small oceanic islands. And what's done here is typically poisons, introduced disease such as panleukopenia, lethal trapping, and hunting. And two examples I think will really illustrate what I'm talking about here. And they're not, obviously pretty far away from most of us, although I think there's at least one or two people on the line tonight who are sort of more or less in the neighborhood of these examples here. I want to talk first about Marion Island because this is the largest island from which cats have successfully been eradicated. And it's about the size of, roughly the size of, say, Detroit or Tampa. It took 19 years to exterminate about 2,200 cats. And again, using the methods, that were mentioned previously. Now, Ascension, before we get to Ascension, this made international news recently, so some of you might be aware of this. So as I said, this is the largest island from which cats have been successfully eradicated. It's considered, or was considered, a great success story. In fact, 20 years on, the Australian government has committed more than $25 million to clean up the aftermath because, not surprisingly, once the cats were gone, the rabbits and then later the mice, their populations exploded. So now the government is having to deal with that. Again, Ascension Island, quite a bit smaller than Marion Island. It's about the size of Miami. And they're a 4-year eradication and restoration project cost taxpayers about $1.3 million. And again, this is a tiny little island, just 34 square miles, and that was the price tag for that project. Now, what about the traditional approach? What about what's been done in this country for about 100 years or more? And that is a complaint-driven impoundment, right? Or, an enforcement officer will come and pick up a cat, or increasingly that's not the case. They won't do that. But you can maybe trap a cat that's been getting on your car or causing other problems, take it to the shelter, and again, it's usually a one-way trip, right? We know this has not stabilized or reduced the numbers. If that were the case, we wouldn't still, 100 plus years later, we wouldn't be having this conversation about the so-called feral cat problem, right? And this study out of Australia that was published earlier this year shed some interesting light on why might it be that this approach just doesn't work. And it's I want to be clear, it's a very different context. I mean, we're not, it's very different from what you see in, say, a densely populated area in the U.S., but there's some real similarities in that what they called low-level culling of cats is not such a stretch from, again, that complaint-based approach that's been used in this country. And what these researchers found through this very interesting, rather detailed study was not only do the numbers not go down, the numbers might actually be increasing. And again, this shed some important light on why what we've been doing in this country can only be considered really a failed policy. So again, if we're looking at this purely from a policy perspective, I think it's safe to say the kind of eradication efforts I just talked about aren't likely to get any traction in this country, nor is the price tag likely to attract a lot of support, which leaves us with the only feasible option being TNR. when I've done a somewhat different version of this presentation at different conferences, I like to tell the audience, I'll show in a slide right after this, and it's sort of like, okay, let's go to Q&A, because we can kind of, in some ways, again, if you're thinking purely policy, we can kind of stop here. I mean, we've laid out the options. That didn't take very long. We've demonstrated why the one is not likely to get any support here. And almost by default, we're left with TNR. Obviously, we're not going to, I'm not going to do that to you tonight. But again, the point is purely from a policy standpoint, you really don't, you rarely need to get into the kind of detail that we're going to get into tonight. But as I said, for the aforementioned reasons, I think it's important to discuss it, but just understand that from a policy perspective, it's kind of, it's pretty clear cut, actually. That said, though, I have to assume everyone who signed up, or most everyone who signed up, they're here for the promised myth busting. Before we actually get to busting some myths, though, I want to find out a little bit about what sort of myths do you hear about most often?
So that brings us to another poll question. Please answer on your screen and not in the Q&A window. Also, I want to encourage the audience to get your questions into Peter so we can have them ready for him at the end of the presentation. So get them in early, please. Which of the following best describes your objection to TNR? Best describes the objection to TNR you heard read about most often? Predation, wildlife impacts, public health concerns like rabies, toxoplasmosis, nuisance complaints, property rights, or other. So which of the following best describes the objection to TNR you hear or read the most about? Please select your answer. And the audience says,
"Wow,
well, that's
okay.
pretty close."
Well, this is.
Yeah.
I was going to say it's just about a dead tie between nuisance complaints and wildlife impacts, which is not quite what I would expect. I guess we can. I'll talk about it with the Maddie's folks offline, and try and convince them to have me back to talk solely about nuisance complaints, because that's not actually in here tonight. But it's interesting that came up so high, because just in the last, couple, 3 weeks, I have been in various conversations with all sorts of different individuals, and it keeps coming up. So the planets have kind of aligned, indicating that we, animal welfare folks, the folks who promote these community cat programs and do the TNR and all the rest of it, we need to do a better job of addressing that issue. I'll give you sort of a teaser right now. I'll tell you there's actually a good deal of evidence to show, very compelling evidence that shows that TNR does, or I should be careful, has the potential to reduce nuisance complaints, and not by a little. I mean, it's really significant. But again, we'll table that. But that's really good feedback. So I'm glad to see that. If I had to bet before this presentation, I would have bet that wildlife impacts would have come up the highest, in part because of all the media accounts that we see. And again, all I did here was just go grab some screenshots. A lot of this stuff, I'm assuming audience members have seen. It's been shared, widely, social media. And this is, these go back just a few years, these particular screenshots. The notion of cats as having an impact on wildlife, though, this is not new. This is not new at all. This goes back to this image you see here is from, it's about 100 years old. It's from 1916, actually. And this is from the state ornithologist from Massachusetts. And this idea of a dual existence, right, that the cats have. And we're talking here, by the way, this is a reference to pet cats. Now, of course, in 1916, pet cats were what? Outdoor cats, because, cat litter doesn't come around until around 1950 or so. But this idea of this dual personality here, right? You've got, on the one hand, the children's pet. On the other hand, you've got this cat who typically at night is out at night, and again is this very dangerous predator. And again, so the point being, this is really nothing new. Now, if we want to think about, as I've described it on my blog, the modern era of the witch hunt against outdoor cats, this goes back just a little more than 20 years to what was called the Wisconsin study. And this was done by a professor in Wisconsin and his PhD student. And they actually did some really interesting research about, in rural Wisconsin, about the density of cats. Where things kind of came off the rails was when they started using those density numbers to extrapolate. And again, they very quickly got into territory they really couldn't support with their own data. And you can see here that, you know, they threw out this enormous number, 219 million. And obviously that's at the high end, but this is the sort of thing that got the attention, not surprisingly, of the media. So this is in an era, you know, before Facebook, before Twitter and all the rest of it, but this got a ton of media attention. And ever since, we've seen similar studies are designed and conducted somewhat differently, but they follow sort of the same template in that you have these different factors that you can kind of come to expect, where you've got inflated estimates of outdoor cats. And there's each of these 3 points here in the orange, there's a number of factors that play into there. I've just listed a couple examples. But in the case of the inflated estimates of outdoor cats, in a lot of cases, they simply ignore the well-documented, this is a number of surveys have shown that about 2/3 of pet cats are indoor only in this country. If you ignore that and you exaggerate, you very quickly increase the number of cats in your total pool of cats. That includes outdoor pets and unowned cats. You increase that by tens of millions very, very quickly. With the predation estimates, again, a number of factors come into play, but one way to do it is by overestimating the number of successful hunters, especially when you're talking about the predation of birds. Not surprisingly, many cats are simply no good at hunting birds. And then the third point is you take each of these errors just to get to your overall, your big number, that 219 million, for example, that I just showed. Just to get there, you get there by multiplication. And there's a few more factors than I'm showing here, but even a little bit of inflation at each step of the way grows very, very quickly by the time you get to your bottom line. And I want to talk a little bit, I'll use as an example this paper from 2013 that was published in Nature Communications. Almost certainly everybody on the call has seen some media story that referred to this. The paper may not have been named, but you've probably seen something that referred to this. And the reason I want to look at it is this has been cited in 60 academic papers. And what happens there is once a paper is cited, it gains credibility with each time it's cited. And before long, no one even questions that original paper. Right? In fact, and this is a whole other, it's a serious problem, it's quite likely that folks who cite it subsequently don't actually read the paper that they're citing. And it's a whole other problem, as I say. But it's also, as I say, you probably have heard of the results of this paper because it was picked up by news outlets in this country and globally. And in fact, one of those screenshots I showed a few back from the New York Times was a reference to this paper. And when I wrote about this on my blog, this goes back, the blog post I did was February of 2013. My blog post was about 3,000 words. I drilled down pretty deeply into this and subsequently have drilled down deeper still and written even more about it and found more problems with it. But we don't need to go anywhere near that. We can just stick with this top line number, this 1.3 to 4 billion birds. And we know from that alone that something is seriously amiss with this estimate. Which brings us to, at long last, we get to the actual busting of myths here. See, because we know it's been estimated there's about 4.7 billion land birds in North America. Okay? And again, remember what these authors are saying is cats are responsible for killing up to 4 billion. So if we put that into context, and they were talking, by the way, about the lower 48. They're not even including Hawaii and Alaska in that total. What they're saying is that free-roaming cats in the U.S. alone, and again, the lower 48, to be more specific, are killing up to 85% of the birds in all of North America every year, year in, year out. If that were even close to being true, there simply wouldn't be any left. Everybody on this call would know if that estimate was even in the ballpark because the implications are so dire. And that doesn't even account for what the 2014 State of the Birds report says about habitat loss, right? So again, you start adding in habitat loss, if that's the far greatest cause of population declines, and these authors were saying that up to 85% of the entire continent's birds are killed every year by cats. Again, this simply doesn't add up, or I guess maybe a more correct way to put it is it adds up to far too much. It simply can't be true. Now, what you see when again, this I just wanted to kind of drill down a little bit into that one paper, but there's a common sort of theme going on here, and that is these folks walk a very fine line when they talk about, they'll generate this wildly inflated estimate, but they never quite name the species or species of birds that are impacted by these cats, right? They walk right up to it and sort of say, well, surely there's an impact there. Look at the size of this number. But they never quite cross that line. And one of the reasons why is because there's a lack of evidence that there is any population level impact. And there's good reasons why. Cats, like all predators, catch what they can. Now, especially in the case of birds, unless you're talking about, seabirds that nest in the ground, or in the case of some parts of the world, flightless birds. But for the most part, birds can fly, which obviously gives them a distinct advantage over cats. Cats catch what they can. And this has led the Royal Society for Protection of Birds, this is in the UK, they're very clear. This is pulled right off their website. I was there just last week to check and make sure it was still there. And what they say is, again, it sounds like a really radical claim. They're saying even if, it looks like there's a lot of predation going on, it's not likely to have any kind of impact because the birds that are being caught are the ones who wouldn't have been around for the next breeding season anyhow. And as I say, this is not a radical claim. It sort of fits very nicely with Biology 101. But it's almost impossible for us to imagine this sort of statement coming out from some of the conservation community in this country. And that's what makes it, I think, seem so radical to us. Now, a little bit closer to home, there's a study, I'm not sure if they're quite wrapped up. I grabbed this about a month ago, and I believe the study was still underway. Jekyll Island off the coast of Georgia, and researchers from the University of Georgia put small video cameras on collars on cats that are part of a managed TNR colony. They wanted to see what were these cats up to. Well, what the cats were up to was just what most of our cats are up to, not a whole lot. Now, it's interesting, though, that when this came out on National Geographic, that they say that these researchers were surprised because the woman who developed this research method, these so-called kitty cams, when she was doing her PhD work at University of Georgia, she told, back in 2012, she told CBS Atlanta that cats aren't as bad as biologists thought, based on the results of her work, which again found that the cats, and this the first study was pet cats, not colony cats, but again, very similarly found that there was not a whole lot of predation of birds going on. Now, when the press release came out from the American Bird Conservancy announcing the results, they were completely twisted, completely misleading. There was no mention of this quote here that the cats weren't as bad as biologists thought. There's another sort of a little bit different component of the wildlife impact thing, and that is sublethal impacts. And this is the idea that the mere presence of cats can have consequences. And I should be clear. Let me just take a minute here to be clear. I'm certainly not saying cats don't kill birds. I'm also not saying that under certain circumstances, cats might have sublethal impacts. What I am saying is those impacts are very often grossly exaggerated. In this case, this was another study out of Britain. This one was I found particularly interesting because, again, they say the mere presence of cats has these consequences, and in this case, it meant the parents, the birds, abandoned the nest. So the thought was, well, surely that has consequences. But there's a couple problems with this, not least of which there were no live cats used in this study. They used one taxidermied cat, and this quote here actually comes from an email I contacted the lead researcher and asked a question about the methods, and he said, and this is the quote I got back, was they used a black and white stuffed cuddly toy cat for this research study, which obviously raises a number of questions about the validity of the work, but there's even beyond, the kind of sort of silliness. I mean, it's hard to imagine how does something like this get peer reviewed, published, and all the rest of it. But there's something even more fundamentally problematic with this is, again, they looked at, they saw, okay, the parents in some cases left the nest, abandoned the nest, but they first of all, they never looked at what came next. More than likely, the parents just went and set up shop in a place where there wasn't going to be a taxidermied cat or a stuffed cat, kind of puzzling them, sitting there not moving for a good long while. But it also ignores this notion of urban winners. There's a number of birds that actually do very well in dense urban areas. And, of course, part of that means not just being comfortable with people, but being comfortable with the companion animals that people bring with them into these areas. All right. The poll question, of course, broke things down into a couple different categories, one of which was public health, and that's the last two items I want to address here in the myth-busting section have to do with public health. The first, of course, being rabies. And again, we see these stories pretty regularly in the press. It makes for good, scary stuff. And again, which these days means clicks, and it means eyeballs, and that means ad revenue. This USA Today story was particularly interesting, and pay close attention to the headline there, right? Feral cat colonies could pose rabies risk, CDC says. Okay? That's a reference to this paper here, and they talk about TNVR programs, and the V just means vaccination, so trap, neuter, vaccinate, returns, the TNR. And so this is what people reading that story in USA Today, the message they got was TNR is essentially it's putting the public at risk. It's a public health risk. However, if you actually read the paper real carefully and move beyond the abstract, especially if you get to the very end of it in small print, there is this disclaimer that, and in fact, you find out that this is not a CDC position on TNR. In fact, it's true, 5 of the 7 authors worked for CDC as their day job, if you will, but it's not a CDC position on this. And yet, again, that was the message, and you can imagine this is scary stuff, right? If in your community you're having a debate about should we do should we formalize TNR, or should the shelter be doing return to the field, whatever, whichever conversation it might be, and someone comes in, brings this into the conversation and says, well, wait a minute, the CDC says this is a serious public health threat. Obviously, that changes the conversation considerably. This was no accident, though. As I say, 5 authors of this paper were CDC employees, one of whom, even before the paper was published, the lead author left CDC in kind of this cloud of controversy, charges of scientific misconduct, research misconduct, and one of the other authors on the paper is the president of the American Bird Conservancy. And it was the American Bird Conservancy's press release that let folks think that this was a CDC paper, and it was their official position on this issue. And as I say, it was not at all the case. How big a threat is rabies? You can see here in the last 20 years, 49 human cases, mostly due to wildlife interactions. The 10 dog bites, by the way, that occurred outside the country, those are mostly military who are deployed, internationally, and where, rabies, there are a lot of free-roaming dogs who aren't vaccinated, so it's a very different context there. In the last 55 years, only 2 cases in this country have been linked to cats. And when I want to be clear, when I say only 2 cases, I'm not, rabies is almost always fatal. I don't want to downplay that. But I want to put it into context. Again, if we're talking about policy issues, risk assessment is a standard part of that process, right? And just from January through August of this year, 26 deaths in this country due to lightning strikes, right? And again, just to put this into context, I mean, we think of, a lightning strike that results in death as being an enormously rare event, and yet look at how many of those compared to rabies cases. And it's also the case, the most recent national figures we have, actually you have to go back to 2013, but they're the lowest. The 2013 figures are the lowest in cats. They're the lowest since 1991. And there's also this little bit of little statistic in there that's easily missed. And admittedly, it's a small sample size, 441 cats, but you can imagine that the vast majority of the cats that are suspected of rabies and are tested for rabies, the vast majority are strays. The folks involved have no history of these cats. In this small sample here where they did have a history of the cat, even those cats that were not up to date but had been vaccinated once, none of those cats were tested positive. So it gives us some sense that even one vaccination as part of a TNR program is providing a public health benefit. It's also true that rabies in cats in this country is not distributed equally. You can see here there are definitely some hot spots. I was, just last week, I was in Sparks, Nevada, just outside of Reno, and there was all sorts of conversation, conversation maybe not the right word. There are a lot of allegations about the threat of rabies, and you can see here, in the whole western part of the U.S., it's in cats, it's virtually a non-issue. When we're talking about public health, though, of course, we're less concerned about rabies in cats or dogs or bats or foxes or skunks or raccoons. We're interested in exposures, right? And there's only been, to my knowledge, there's only been one national study that's looked at exposures in humans. And what they found was cats aren't anything like the threat they're made out to be so often. In fact, dogs were 6 times more likely to send someone to the ER for rabies treatment. And again, it's important that I be clear. I'm not trying to shift the blame or point fingers at it's the dogs we need to look out for. Again, I'm just trying to put this into context and support it all with facts. Now, when was the last time you saw a headline about the threat posed by dogs in this country where rabies is concerned? Pretty unheard of. The second public health issue, I'm assuming a lot of folks have heard about toxoplasmosis. This is, and this, of course, not surprisingly, this gets all sorts of media attention, whether you're talking about risks of brain cancer or early childhood development problems, or most commonly you hear about links to mental illness. It's scary stuff, right? And we know that fear is a great motivator. And one of the reasons there's so much fear surrounding this is there's very little understanding on the part of the general public. And, it's also true that the science, there's a great deal of research into this, but there's a great deal of uncharted territory that still needs to be covered. All right, so what about the real threat of this parasite, this Toxoplasma gondii parasite? It is true that cats, large and small cats, are the definitive host. And all that means is that this parasite reproduces inside of the cat, and in infected cats, it can be these oocysts, these little kind of spores, can be shed in the cat's feces. However, again, put this in context, give a little bit of perspective. This is not the only way folks get infected. Undercooked or raw meat is certainly a source of infection. And if you go to the CDC website, you'll see that just basic hand washing is essentially the recommended countermeasure or the preemptive measure to take in this case. It's also true, and again, this is only if cats become infected. And the way they become infected is by encountering infected prey. They shed oocysts only once in their lifetime. And once they've done that, that's it. And again, when I say infected only by encountering infected prey, if you have indoor-only cats, as I do, and you're not feeding them raw meat or anything like that, there's no reason to think that they would ever become infected. Now, I want to use this opportunity. There's this clever little tool we've got available to us where I can take the pulse of the audience. I'm going to do this in just a second. What I want to know is if you have heard, I'm guessing most folks, again, have seen headlines like the one I just showed about toxoplasmosis being related to mental illness. But I'm wondering, has anyone heard about mental illness being related to breastfeeding? And I'm just going to do this real quick. And again, if you've heard, if this is something that's come across your radar, however that might be, but some link between toxoplasmosis and breastfeeding, give it a thumbs up. If not, give it a thumbs down. And then we'll just move on, and I'll kind of get to I'll reveal the secret behind this, if you will. Okay. Well, we got 6. I'm looking at 6, 7 thumbs up and 148 thumbs down. And honestly, that's more folks have heard of this than I would have guessed. What's interesting about this is this quote is from the paper you see on the right, and if you look at the title, there's nothing about breastfeeding in that. It's all it's this question about what about the risks of cats and toxoplasmosis. And yet, what these researchers, and this is a team at Johns Hopkins, they've done a lot of research about toxoplasmosis. They're quoted in the media all the time. They're also quoted very often by TNR opponents. What they found was the link between mental illness and breastfeeding was actually stronger than the link between toxoplasmosis and early childhood cat ownership, right? Now, again, I want to be very clear here. There is not a link between breastfeeding and mental illness later in life. And in fact, there's good evidence from other studies to demonstrate that, if anything, breastfeeding might offer a measure of protection. Again, the reason I wanted to bring this up here was very few people have heard of this, but had I asked a different poll question, had I asked who's heard of the connection between mental illness and toxoplasmosis, I'm guessing everybody would have responded positively there. What's the fundamental problem with these links, these relationships, these connections between toxoplasmosis or toxo-infection and these various things, whether it's breastfeeding, whether it's cat ownership, whatever it is, this is nothing more than correlation, not the same as causation at all. And again, that's a really important point. That's why I've got it on here twice. It is not the same thing as saying one can be linked to the other in a causal way. Now, let me give you an example to explain the importance there, or how that can kind of be a trap if we don't keep that distinction clear. For those of you old enough to remember, there was this NutraSweet scare in the mid-90s. It's artificial sweetener had just come on the market, and a few years later, all of a sudden, scientists are seeing brain tumors on the rise. And so there's, as is often the case, there's sort of this hunch that says, well, maybe there's a relationship here. The two are both increasing, but there was a lot that was increasing in the 1990s, right? Not least of which cable TV, the Sony Walkman, Tom Cruise's career, all of these things are on the rise as brain tumors are on the rise, as is, by the way, out-of-control government spending. And again, these are, some kind of silly examples. These are, by the way, highly recommend this book if this is the sort of thing that appeals to it all, this book called Proofiness. And again, it just illustrates the trap we can get in when we forget that or overlook the fact that correlation and causation are not the same thing. It's a little bit like, imagine I've got some plants out on my patio, and maybe, after some time, it occurs to me that, the more often the pet sitter is here, the worse those plants look. And it might be absolutely true, and I might have all sorts of evidence. I've got photos and a calendar and all of it. But what really is probably going on is the pet sitter's here because I'm out of town, and the more I'm out of town, the more those plants get neglected. Again, you could show a really strong correlation, but it's not the same thing at all as saying there's a causal link between the two. Now, that said, toxoplasmosis is a legitimate public health concern, like just as rabies. Again, but the point is, when the claims are so wildly exaggerated, it really gets in the way of an honest discussion about public policy. And in this case, one of the real the tricks with toxo is you've got studies that can't even agree on what the important risk factors are. Obviously, that has implications for public health advice. It would be, imagine if we just didn't quite understand influenza, how I get the flu, and how, if I'm hanging out, if I'm traveling on a plane, then someone else on the plane is liable to get the flu. If we didn't understand the transmission routes and all the rest of it with the flu, how would we possibly give good public health advice, right? So that's one of the tricks there. It's also true that the rate of infection in this country has dropped dramatically in recent years. And I want to point out, too, infection, we have to be careful about that category because, generally speaking, folks infected with this parasite are asymptomatic. And that's true, of course, of a lot of parasites. We in our daily lives, we run into stuff all the time. We're infected with all sorts of things that, rarely materialize as anything. So again, I want to make sure that's clear. But even with that said, again, you look at the pretty steep decline in recent years. This is, and imagine, this is over the same time period when TNR is really taking off in this country, in large part because of Alley Cat Allies, right? 25 years old this year. And so TNR is taking off. At the same time, Toxoplasma infection is dropping off. Now, those of you who have been paying careful attention are probably thinking, well, wait a minute, you just told us about, the difference between correlation and causation. And it's true. this is another case of correlation, not causation. However, it does provide some really compelling evidence to counter the claim that TNR creates somehow a greater risk of toxoplasmosis or infection of this parasite in the environment. And TNR offers another benefit where toxo is concerned. It's really interesting. And again, it's not so surprising if you really think about it. As I said, cats, in order to become infected, a cat has to encounter infected meat, right? Well, if we subsidize these cats with food, that is, they're a managed colony, if we subsidize them with food, we reduce a lot of their pressure to hunt, so consequently, we reduce the likelihood of infection. So again, and this extends a level of protection in terms of human infection. Which brings us to our last poll question.
Our final poll question of the evening. And we do have a lot of time for Q&A afterwards, so please stay with us. I also want to remind the audience that many of these slides had footnotes on them, and these would be good ammunition for you, so to speak, to take to your city council or your county commission to use as studies compared to some of our opponents. So that is in the handout in the green file widget at the bottom of your screen. Just open up the presentation handout and save it, and then you can print it anytime you want. So the last poll question is, on a scale of 1 to 10, with 1 being the lowest or unprepared and 10 being the highest or prepared, describe how prepared you feel right now, having participated in the webinar, to respond thoughtfully to critics of TNR. And you can see your selection there will be 1 to 2, 3 to 4, 5 to 6, 7 to 8, 9 to 10. On a scale of 1 to 10, describe how prepared you feel right now, having participated in the webinar, to respond thoughtfully to critics of TNR. Let's see what the polls say.
This is the first time in the last, 57 minutes that I've actually exhaled, because I was kind of holding my breath because this could have gone terribly wrong, right? We always hear that attorneys will never ask a question in the courtroom unless they know exactly what the answer is going to be. I'm not so careful sometimes, and have this come back where 85% answered 1 to 2. I would probably be having a long conversation, or maybe no conversation, with the folks at Maddie's afterwards. So I'm glad to see things shifted in the right direction. A whole lot more people, roughly half of the audience, feeling a 7 to 8 level of confidence. And again, Lynn pointed out with the handout, there's more information there. And of course, folks are free to contact me if they want even more details, or to take a look at any of the actual studies. I'm happy to share that with folks as well. And just before we get to Q&A, I'll just wrap up real quick. Looking at the science, I think it's pretty clear at this point. There's a lot of it is badly flawed. In a lot of cases, it's not accidental that it's badly flawed. This is agenda-driven. And knowingly or not, I want to say in most cases it's probably knowingly, these folks are tapping into a mainstream media that it has a really strong incentive to kind of beat the drum when they hear about whether it's toxoplasmosis causing brain cancer or mental illness, whatever, or whether it's about rabies, or whether it's about 4 billion birds a year. They're really tapping into a media that loves nothing more than those kinds of stories. If we come all the way back again to this idea that this is a public policy issue, imagine what would happen if all of these claims were really taken seriously. And again, I haven't touched on all of them. I kind of hit, I think, sort of the highlights. But if all of this stuff was taken seriously, it wouldn't be unreasonable to think that there would be, in some cases, pretty strong restrictions and outright prohibitions on TNR. And imagine there's sort of this whole ironic component to all of this. If that were the case, everything, all of the issues that these same folks are so passionate about, whether it's wildlife, whether it's public health, everything moves in the wrong direction because you've got more unvaccinated, unsterilized cats out in the environment, not fewer. Invariably, you would have more predation. You would very likely have more of rabies and whatever other zoonotic diseases are out there. So there's sort of this bizarre irony to the whole thing where, some of the folks who are really pushing hard any which way they can against TNR, if they got their way, it actually is it's a tremendous detriment to their cause. And with that, I think I see some, there's my email address. Thank you, Lynn, for adding that in there. And Lynn, I'm not sure how you want to handle the Q&A. I see there's questions in the folder.
Oh, there are questions, and what I'll do is we'll just take them one at a time. I'm going to push the first question to the slide area. Is there any reason why the Nature Communications publication saying cats kill 1.3 to 4 billion birds has more clout than serious Royal Society and U.S. government State of Birds reports citing habitat loss as the biggest problem?
That's a really good question. One of the reasons I like this question is because it's making connections, right, between these various pieces. So a couple points come to mind. One is the state of the most obvious, I suppose, is the State of the Birds report is 2014. The Nature Communications publication was published in late January of 2013. However, that said, and I didn't touch on this, the State of the Birds report also, it's very strange, it also cites those numbers from the Nature Communications paper. So if you look at the State of the Birds report, if that's all you look at, it really doesn't make sense because, again, there's the mortalities, you add up the mortalities, and it far exceeds the number of birds. So it's kind of crazy that way. In terms of the traction or the credibility behind that Nature Communications publication, a couple things. It is, two of the authors were, I believe still are, with the Smithsonian Migratory Bird Center. So you've got the Smithsonian name, which is, carries enormous weight in this country. The other author is from U.S. Fish and Wildlife. Different entity, but again, has in certain circles has a great deal of credibility. And in fact, this paper was, we know through documents obtained through a Freedom of Information Act request, this paper was one of 3 written as part of a grant from U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, more than $300,000. Right. So again, this gets back to the point I made much earlier about public funding. Smithsonian, among others, made sure that, and rightfully so, they've got a fabulous PR office, and they made sure that this story got a lot of attention. And of course, these days, these things have a snowball effect. So once it gets a little bit of attention, it gets more attention. And as I say, this got international attention. And part of it was, the final point I'll just say is, inherent in any time you put a number like that, like 4 billion, even the median, which was like 2.4 billion. Anytime you have a number like that, that just again, it makes for a great headline. They handed the media an easy, very sexy headline that was going to get all sorts of eyeballs and clicks and shares and all the rest of it that really matters these days. To come back and say what the Royal Society is saying in the UK is not a great headline. You know, refuting that and saying, well, no, this is wildly exaggerated. It's a far more accurate assessment of the situation, but it's not media friendly to say, well, no, it's not. I don't know if that helps.
Yes, it does. Let's go to the next question.
Okay.
One of the biggest concerns I hear from anti-TNR people is that the quality of life for feral community cats is appalling. How do I counter that? Yeah,
it is exactly right. This is it is exactly as you say. I'm not sure who this is, but it is a common concern I heard here. And again, just a few points to touch on. And whoever submitted this question, please, if you want to contact me again at that email address that Lynn just showed, please do so I can give you a more complete answer. And that's just sort of a standing offer. But a couple of things come to mind here. So I always find it a little bit, maybe more than a little bit, disingenuous for these same folks who, seem just dead set against TNR and perfectly okay with lethal roundups or complaint-based impoundments. It seems disingenuous that are they really concerned about the welfare of these cats on the street? Maybe in some cases, take some folks at their word, but in some cases, it's just they're looking for traction, right? That can't appeal to you because it can't appeal to the predation appeal is not working, so I'm going to try the animal welfare appeal, whatever it might be. There are actually those studies that show, and I'm thinking of, these are big thousands of cats in San Jose, California, and also in Alachua County, Florida, where Julie Levy has been running Operation Catnip for quite some time. And what these studies found was the vast majority, like you're talking a fraction of 1% of the cats coming into these programs needed to be euthanized, and I use that word in its correct sense, euthanized upon intake. They came in and they were not fit to be put back out. They were in bad shape. That's a fraction of 1%. And the other thing that's interesting that John Cicerelli up in San Jose, California found was that the number, after they implemented this program, 4 years later, the number of cats that were found dead along the roadside decreased by 20%. So even the notion of putting them back out there into this dangerous world, they thought, well, we're going to see the consequences. And in fact, in part of I attribute that to the fact that the cats are much less likely to roam once they've been sterilized, and so they're not crossing roads and doing some of those behaviors. Now that said, I don't want to leave this out. None of us, I don't think, who do this enjoy putting cats back out into the environment. I kind of think of this as triage. It's the best we can do now and in the foreseeable future, but it's not anybody's first choice.
Okay, are we ready for the next one? Let's take this next question. How can a paper that calls toxoplasmosis a viral zoonosis even be published in a journal? Who would really take this paper seriously with this major flaw?
It's an excellent question for a couple reasons. One of which is, it's an excellent question because I can't answer it, sort of, in that as I say, I've been blogging, I've been reading and writing about this for going on 6 years now, and I am forever scratching my head about the stuff that gets published in prestigious journals. It's been through peer review. I mean, the whole, and this, of course, this is how it's often held up by opponents of TNR as, kind of gold standard, and that they will use those words very clearly. It'll be peer-reviewed study, If it's that team from Johns Hopkins, they'll name drop that to lend credibility. All of this, and I think, again, this gets into a whole other, another discussion, but flaws with the peer review process and the publication process, which these days has its own challenges in terms of oversight and, of course, the pressure for people to publish. Some of these journals are what they call pay to publish. So, if you pay, you can get your work published. In other cases, it's true that it's peer reviewed, and that means it's typically like 2 or 3 other people familiar with, and not just people, these are PhDs, established, published, all the rest of it. They review the work, provide some feedback before it gets published. And sometimes there's a lot of back and forth between the editorial folks, the reviewers, the authors. But in a lot of cases, as the author, you also get to suggest who should review it. Well, it doesn't have your name on it when the reviewers see it, but it's a small world, and they're going to know when they have your paper in front of them, and they're probably going to treat it, pretty gently. Again, so part of the answer to this is, in my mind, and I'm sure it's true elsewhere, but in this field, things have gotten pretty sloppy in some cases. And again, in this case, the question for those who haven't sort of sussed out the detail here, the idea of a viral zoonosis, I mentioned Toxoplasma gondii is it's not a virus, it's a parasite. And so, again, this is the sort of thing that you would think immediately would be caught and rectified, or the paper rejected, or there would be some conversation, and yet it seemed to have gotten through the system.
Okay, here's the next question, Peter.
Okay.
And these are all really good questions. We know many anti-TNR studies are based on junk science. Are there any ironclad studies that support TNR?
Yeah, it's a good question. Obviously, it was not the focus of this webcast wasn't making a case for TNR, so I didn't get into any of those. I do have, and I was going to suggest you check on my blog on Vox Felina for these things, but they're kind of sprinkled around. So again, if it's the sort of thing you want a list, I actually have a nice, it's like a page long, with just a brief description in the citation. And if whoever the person who posed this question wants to contact me through email, I'm happy to share that. But the answer for everybody is, so this is a little tough, because when you say ironclad, science is rarely ironclad. When you get into, that's why they have, statistical likelihoods and all the rest of it. I always sort of think kind of it's a red flag when someone says, oh, a new study proves that X is related to Y or whatever it might be. Because, proof is pretty hard to come by in any of these natural sciences, the kind of stuff we're looking at. But there are some really interesting studies done at a colony level. The most interesting, I think, it was Felicia Nutter's PhD work in, I think it's Randolph County, I can't remember, North Carolina. It was a 7-year study, so long-term TNR colonies versus colonies that were not sterilized, and not surprisingly, the sterilized colonies were reduced in numbers, the ones that weren't increased in numbers until I think it was like 4 years in, something like that. She sterilized the control colonies, and they started to decrease in number as well. There's some interesting work out of Rome. The one out of Rome, without getting into too much detail, it's interesting. It was a survey of caregivers, and what they found was, although the colony numbers might initially increase when they started counting, over 2 years, 4 years, 6 years, the numbers did start to decrease despite the fact that new cats were showing up. And it's a really important point is even though new ones were showing up, the numbers are still decreasing. And then the final comment I would make on this question is, and I don't want this to sound like I'm avoiding the notion of the ironclad study, but we do have to be mindful of the baseline where TNR is concerned. Because again, we get back to that, what have we got in the toolbox? Well, we've got the sort of things that have been done on these islands like Ascension Island and Marion Island. Well, that's a no-go in this country. And so that kind of puts us, tips us right over to TNR. And so while I'm all in favor and hope to participate in those sort of studies that'll provide more compelling evidence of TNR's effectiveness, I kind of feel like given the baseline we've got, we know what we've been doing in this country hasn't worked. It's kind of a low bar to do better than that, if that makes any sense.
Okay, good answer. This question is, what about the study by Darcy Catilla for her MS degree thesis about failure of TNR efforts on Catalina Island?
Yeah, it's a good question, again, without getting into a lot of details that other folks online tonight aren't going to be familiar with. I'm familiar with the work. What the aspects of this study I'm more familiar with is her looking at the range of these cats on this island, and I don't see this in any way as a failure of TNR. If anything, there was maybe not enough of it, but again, the more interesting aspect of this study to me is she did radio collar telemetry work, so she could see where the cats were going on the island, and that was interesting. But I have to say, I don't think I've ever seen this study held up as an example where TNR didn't work. So yeah, I apologize if that's not a great answer, but certainly the questioner is free to contact me about this Catalina Island work.
Okay, very good. Why do you think certain bird groups continue to be so anti-TNR when supporting TNR would be in their and the bird's best interest? Again, this is one of those. I wish, after reading and writing about this subject for almost 6 years now, I wish I had a good answer. I've asked, in fact, I say asked, through, say, online discussions, there's, pointed out the fact that opposition to TNR seems to be counter to their interests as well, and have never gotten a very clear answer to this. Now, I will say, and I should have, I'm glad this question was asked because I should have maybe sort of prefaced the whole presentation with this. I do want to be very careful about not grouping everybody together. I don't want to say the birders, and I'm using air quotes right now, or the conservation community, and use these very broad terms and throw everybody into that category. I think it's probably the case that an awful lot of the folks, whether it's specifically in the different bird advocacy groups or conservationists more broadly, I think a lot of them, frankly, they just don't get into the fray. They don't because they don't buy it. They see it for what it is, and simply they think it's kind of foolish to have these very rancorous debates back and forth about the merits of TNR, or how many cats are really out there, how many birds do they really kill, all the rest of it. And what that does is it kind of allows for those who kind of want to take up that challenge to do so unchecked.
they're not getting pushback from their own community. And quite frankly, I think it's mostly, what I see is mostly the American Bird Conservancy, which, I mean, they have certainly taken the lead on this issue in terms of the, as I say, what I call the modern era witch hunt against outdoor cats. But I don't think they reflect a broad constituency at all. You see it occasionally. Local Audubon groups, will come out and oppose a TNR program in a particular community. But again, the fundamental question here, I mean, it's basically why are they voting against their own interest? I wish I could tell you. I'm still puzzled over that.
All right, here's one. This question is, we live in a county that fortunately has managed feral cat law, but the villages in the county want to fight it. Your info will help, but what we need is pro bono legal advice. Do you know of any sources for that?
Ooh, pro bono legal advice. I can tell you I'm not it. I'm not an attorney in any state, so I'm sure I can't help you directly. You can, I mean, here's the thing, the legal, whatever legal counsel you might get really has to be local. I mean, you need to be licensed to practice in your state for one thing, but the more they know about what's going on there, the better. Now, that said, again, I realize we can't exactly have a back and forth conversation online here, but again, you're free to contact me offline. It may not be that you may not need actually legal advice. It may be easier to clear up than you think. And again, if you want to send me the question directly to my email, peterw@bestfriends.org, I'm happy to hear more about the situation so I can give you a better answer. But it's true, by the way, that broadly speaking, if you're talking about getting an ordinance change, or especially if you're talking about getting a state law changed, then yes, at that point you get into attorneys, you get into lobbyists, sometimes almost certainly at the state level, and that can get prohibitively expensive. But there are folks out there, and this is the thing too, as more communities are doing this, as more precedents are set, it's going to be less of a challenge. So the barriers won't be quite as many and as significant as they are right now.
Yes, and maybe Alley Cat Allies would be able to help with that question too. Here's the next one. I recently attended an animal welfare conference where the rep from Michigan Department of Agriculture nearly choked when he said TNR. Are there any state governments who support TNR, and what can we do to change state government?
Well, of course, it depends a little bit what's meant by state government. And again, every state's going to be a little bit different in terms of who's got the oversight. And this is true of state government, but also as you get down to the county and city level too, who's got jurisdiction? Is it the Department of Health? Is it the Department of Agriculture? So those sorts of things all sort of play into it. I can tell you, and so this is the interesting thing is at a state level, there aren't too many precedents we can look at. Now, Best Friends wrote the Community Cat Act for Utah a couple years ago, and that was passed. But even just where I am in Arizona, this last legislative session, the Arizona legislature, and they're not exactly known to be animal friendly, but they passed a law that now allows for cats eligible for a return to field program are no longer subject to the 72-hour holding time. So that's again rather a large milestone, considering again, our legislature, quite frankly, is not known for their animal-friendly bills, and yet this actually got very little opposition. So I think change is coming, and part of that is going to have it's being able to make a case using where you're able to have those thoughtful conversations using the kind of evidence I presented tonight. So, for example, Michigan Department of Agriculture, you'd have to know really in details what is their real objection to this. Is it public health? Is it in that case? Is it rabies? Is it and kind of have a thoughtful, respectful conversation, but really point to the fact that, look, what you guys are doing isn't working. It's not benefiting the cats, certainly. It's not benefiting the communities or the shelters, and it's not benefiting the Department of Agriculture. But again, these are, they tend to be long conversations. It's not infrequently that it takes a couple, 3 years to get a piece of legislation passed, and part of that is building a coalition. But the final point I would make here is, Best Friends commissioned a national survey last year, and we found that roughly 7 in 10 Americans they prefer TNR as the method for managing community cats in their neighborhood. That's not nothing, right? So when you're talking about persuading elected officials, those sorts of things are really important. These people are voters. They contribute to campaigns, all the rest of it. And I see Amber just put a comment up here. Good comment, yes. Brian Cordes,
go ahead.
From PetSmart. Yeah, Brian Cordes from PetSmart Charities is a lawyer. Granted, he's a lawyer licensed in New York. Yes, I happened to be at this Rethinking the Cats Symposium sponsored by the Humane Society of the United States and PetSmart Charities just a couple days ago. And it was a fabulous presentation. And Brian told us at the time, if any of you want this, email me and I can get it to you. So I'm not sure how I'm going to do this, but I know I can get it from Brian. And if someone wants it from me, email me and I'll make sure you get it too. Because it's a beautiful step-by-step, here's how you persuade elected officials. It was really, really well done.
Excellent. So we're going to take one more question, and then we'll wrap up for the evening. And this one is from the Devil's Advocate. Playing Devil's Advocate here for a moment, how do community cat colonies attrition when irresponsible pet owners keep abandoning their cats outside? Where do they all go if they're not managed the traditional way by trapping and killing?
Right. So a couple points here. One, if it's, and I don't think nobody's going to argue that it's okay for people to dump their cats, to leave them behind, whatever the case may be. And I think it's a valid point to suggest, as many TNR opponents do, that if people know that there's they may not use the term managed colony, but if they know, hey, there's some cats down the street and they look like they've got it pretty good. Someone's feeding them, they might not need to know anything about TNR, but they know these cats got a good thing going. And so they're going to, what's one more cat, 2 more cats. Nobody is condoning that. And as you can imagine from an enforcement, yes, it's illegal, but enforcement, is virtually impossible. Now that said, managed colonies, one of the great things about them is new arrivals are immediately spotted. If they're adoptable, they're often pulled for adoption. Often that means those of us who are caregivers bring them home and they end up in our own homes. But if they can be adopted, they're often pulled. If nothing else, the caregiver is able to make sure, because it's a managed colony, they're vigilant, they're able to make sure that if nothing else, these cats are sterilized and vaccinated. Versus, imagine the scenario, no TNR, now that same dumped cat is out there, possibly unsterilized, possibly unvaccinated, and now completely off the radar. So how many cats, kittens, litters will result from that versus the managed colony model. And again, to be clear, it's not a great answer in terms of, things are messy, but as I said, I kind of think of this as triage. It's the best we've got. It's imperfect. It's not suitable for every context everywhere, but it's the best we've got. And even in this case, it's far superior to the way this has been handled in the past.
Well, thank you very much, Peter. This has been really informative. That's the end of our event tonight. We also want to thank all of you for your time. We invite you to take a few minutes to complete the survey. Your feedback is important to us. Click on the link on your screen. If for some reason you don't see the link, it is also in the resource file at the bottom of your screen. The link will be emailed to you in a few days. This webcast will be available on demand shortly, and we hope you will share this presentation on your social sites. Please take advantage of our free on-demand webcasts available on our website at maddiesinstitute.org, and plan to join us on December 10th for Getting the Most Out of Shelter Medicine with Dr. Christy Camilla and Carol Novello with the Humane Society of Silicon Valley. Join us for a comprehensive look at the benefits of giving a veterinarian a policy-making role in shelter operations. Thanks again for being here with us this evening, and good night.